It wouldn't be until the release of Sunset Harbor 5 years after Cities Skylines 1 was released originally in 2015 that players would get the ability to surface their metro systems without mods. It was quite literally a dark time then for our Sims, as they would disappear into an underground network with nowhere to go but further into the darkness. Fast forward to 2023, and the good news is that Sims will be able to see the light when they take their metros. But will they stop? I'm not so sure, but I do want to take a look at the public transit options in Cities Skylines 2 and share some of my thoughts. And for those that are new to my channel, my name is Michael, and I want to welcome you to Sovereign Gaming in City Builders. This is the YouTube channel where I build worlds, cities, and share my thoughts on video games in the city builder gaming space. Cities Skylines 2 is revolutionizing the gameplay of public transit in many ways. Today, I want to review some of those exciting changes and share some of my thoughts on how I'll apply them to my Cities Skylines 2 game when it comes out later this month in October. Let's start with the depots. One of the most obvious evolutions in public transit designing within Cities Skylines 2 includes having to place stops and lines separately, allowing players deeper options to customize their routes. But the other update with public transit is the need to have depots that actually have a purpose. You see, in Cities Skylines 1, we could have depots, but like with the exception of the taxi depot, for example, they would spawn an endless amount of buses or vehicles. Now, I get there was some sort of a circulation system going on for depots where a bus had to return, but I never noticed that in action, and I would honestly forget about it, and I would still place my depots to the outskirts of my city without ever having to worry about them or look at them ever again. After watching some of the early access playthroughs, depots have more of a purpose now, which is something that I've always wanted in Cities Skylines 1. Specifically, they have an impact on the amount of vehicles that they can send out. I'm also impressed with the scale that these depots come in, especially with the train, metro, and tram depots. And why I'm so impressed with them is that they are much larger. Like, you have to be conscious when planning your city in order to incorporate them gracefully within your city framework. I get that the early access videos from Cities players are in a time crunch, but I can count on one hand where I feel like a train depot was placed and decorated realistically, which is a challenge that I would absolutely love. Now, I feel like we will finally have functional train yards instead of needing to, I guess, decorate, and I use that term loosely, an area with a bunch of extra rails that just eat up your nodes from, or at least back in Cities Skylines 1, that was the case. Speaking of the scale, I have always found that Cities Skylines 1 as a franchise, and especially towards the end of the franchise, really struggled with reconciling its scale and deciding how large or how small it wanted to be. And I say that based on the airports and industries DLCs alone. Essentially, both of those expansion packs introduced gameplay that were both very large in scale in comparison to what the rest of the franchise was offering at the time. Even the campus DLC, which introduced some varsity sports facilities, challenged players with finding space to incorporate all of the DLC's features. So, you know, I'm really glad to see the scale is certainly addressed now. And you know, even the most developed cities on YouTube don't use all three of the universities offered in the campus DLC, even when those players use the 81 tile mod. So it just kind of goes to show that even modded games have an imbalance with the scale that Cities Skylines purports to have. And so I wanted to point this out because I really feel like Cities Skylines 2 is learning from its predecessor, and that it needs, or its ancestor, I guess, and that it needs to commit to a scale. And I feel like it is doing just that with these depots being a more realistic size. Now, if we ever get an airports DLC for Cities Skylines 2, I'm sure that the expanded modular airports won't feel as out of place like it did with its Cities Skylines 1 entry. Now let's talk about stations and routes. Firstly, I just want to say that I absolutely love the fact that we are able to set up outside connections from the base game. Honestly, even in modded games, the outside connections for every transportation option got a little crazy. Like the freight trains were the bane of every player's existence unless you had mods to like significantly control them. And having the ability to set up a freight line and then control how many vehicles are on an outside connection is the lifesaver that we have needed all this time. So thank you, Colossal Order, for actually delivering on something that we desperately needed. I think that when it comes to like placing stops and designing the routes for all of the public transit options, that it will take some time getting used to for players. Like, I think that the important thing is the route flexibility, since players will no longer be forced to accept a bus route needing to snake through a sleepy suburb just to do a loop. Now we can drag that loop to affect the other side of the suburb depending on how we're feeling that day. Speaking of the bus stops, I really like how they offer both regular stops and bus shelters. However, I don't get why we wouldn't get the same kind of an option for trams. All trams get are stops, like not shelters as far as I know at this time. And when it comes to trams, there are definitely tram systems out there that have sheltered stops. Heck, some of them even feel more like full-on stations in some cities. Now let's talk about an elephant in the room that I alluded to in my intro. Let's talk about the lack of elevated metro stops for a quick second. I mentioned in a previous video that sometimes it feels like the Paradox Colossal Order team leaves a good idea unfinished, and this is kind of an example of this. We're given the ability to surface and elevate our metro rails, but we're left without an elevated metro station. When I first came across this conundrum, I also realized that we're missing a couple of other important station types as well. What about elevated passenger rail stations, for example, or underground passenger rail stations? There are also not any elevated tram stations or underground tram stations either. Granted, in Cities Skylines 1, we really didn't get any underground or elevated passenger rail stations until one of the DLCs, and I know for a fact that we didn't get any underground or elevated tram stations unless you count the items that were available in the workshop. By the way, great job on creating those. If there are any creators that are watching this, you guys are the best. Yet, using elevated rails seems so easy since it can clip directly on top of roads or snap directly on top of roads like we saw in one of the developer playthroughs. We just won't have the ability to use elevated stations, which is a little annoying to me. But hey, maybe they're working on it for an update or for a future DLC. That would be pretty cool, and I would like that. In fact, that would be one of my requests for an update or a future DLC. And when it comes to the passenger train station, I kind of feel like we need a smaller scaled version of it, and I know that the community has been vocal about getting a small version of it as well. Like, it comes with like 3 platforms if I remember correctly, which you can upgrade to, which is great for a busy, dense neighborhood, but for destinations out in small towns or suburbs where it would make sense to have passenger rail, the scale of this train station just feels too big for them. This was one train station that there was one train station, that I used constantly from the workshop, and I think it was called the Swedish train station, and the reason why I loved it was because it had such a small footprint and it did the job. And also, like, the mass transit expansion pack came with several passenger rail stations that would feel appropriate for smaller urban areas. So I desperately want a smaller scale station in this case here. And what kind of sucks in a way is that the passenger rail station that we're given, like, even though we can upgrade into those future additional platforms and all of that, and like there's even a bypass rail if I remember correctly with it. It's just too bad that it didn't start out as a small footprint rail station, and instead, like, we're just given something that's actually a lot bigger even when left unupgraded, if that makes any sense. Like, it would have been nice to actually upgrade into those additional platforms rather than start off with all 2 or 3 platforms that it comes with. speaking of the workshop as well, like I'm honestly going to be on the lookout for modular transit stations when I do go shopping on that workshop. I think that it's just smart to have modular stations that allows for the player to that really allows the player to offer any additional platforms or such, since that capability is clearly demonstrated with the passenger rail station we get in the base game. So for example, I would love to download a version of the underground metro station that allowed me to upgrade it with extra perpendicular or even parallel platforms to create an interchange station. But that's just me. What do you guys think on that idea? At this time, I want to give you the floor on what you think about all of the transportation options being offered. Do you think that having modular transit stations should be the status quo? Are you bummed that elevated stations of any kind, as far as I can tell, aren't making it into the game? Or do you think that the incredible creators on the workshop will be able to deliver and come to the rescue to help fill this void? Comment below with your thoughts. I would love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video and would like to keep up with my content, then feel free to like this video and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you again for watching Sovereign Gaming and City Builders, and I hope you have yourself a wonderful day.